Sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the one who sees everything. This is the story of how silence became the most powerful weapon against injustice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Madison Chun had always been good at reading people. Not their words, those had been silent to her since birth, but their expressions, their body language, the way they carried themselves through the hallways of Jefferson High. As she walked through the main entrance on her first day, backpack slung over one shoulder, she noticed how students naturally formed clusters. Invisible boundaries marking territory as clearly as painted lines. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Madison adjusted her hearing aids, not that they helped much, but they made other people more comfortable somehow. She'd learned that small accommodations often made the difference between acceptance and isolation. Her interpreter, Mrs. Rodriguez, had arrived early to meet with the teachers. Madison appreciated the gesture, but she'd grown accustomed to navigating most situations on her own. Lip reading had become second nature, and her peripheral vision had developed beyond what most people thought possible. She caught conversations from across rooms, noticed glances that others missed, picked up on the subtle social dynamics that hearing students took for granted. The first period bell rang, a vibration she felt more than heard, and students began moving toward their classes. Madison pulled out her schedule, carefully printed with room numbers and teacher names. A P chemistry with Mr. Patterson, first period. She'd always excelled in sciences, finding comfort in the logical progression of formulas and reactions that didn't require verbal communication to understand. Room 204 was on the second floor, and Madison climbed the stairs behind a group of students who seemed to know exactly where they were going. Their confidence reminded her of her old school, where she'd finally found her place among the academic clubs and study groups. Moving to a new city in senior year hadn't been her choice, but her father's job transfer had left the family little option. The chemistry lab was modern, with blacktop tables arranged in pairs and safety equipment mounted on every wall. Students were already claiming seats, and Madison noticed the familiar pattern friends gravitating toward each other, leaving the uncertain students to fill in the gaps. She chose a table near the front, not because she needed to be closer to the teacher, but because she'd learned that positioning herself where she could see everyone's faces made classroom dynamics easier to follow. Mr. Patterson was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes. He noticed Madison immediately and walked over with a warm smile. "You must be Madison Chun. I got the note from the office about your accommodation needs. I've taught several deaf students over the years, so please don't hesitate to let me know if you need anything." Madison read his lips carefully and nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson. I can handle most things on my own, but I appreciate you letting me know." The teacher seemed genuinely pleased by her response. "Excellent. I have you paired with Tyler Morrison for lab work. He's one of my most reliable students." Tyler Morrison turned out to be a quiet boy with dark hair and serious brown eyes. He raised his hand slightly when Mr. Patterson called his name, and Madison could see him sizing her up with curiosity rather than judgment. When she moved to sit beside him, he turned his body slightly toward her, a small gesture that showed he understood she needed to see his face to communicate. "I'm Tyler," he said clearly, making sure she could read his lips. "I've worked with deaf students before in my volunteer work at the community center. Just let me know if you need me to repeat anything or if there's a better way for us to work together." Madison felt a wave of relief. "Thank you. I can read lips pretty well, and I'll speak up if I miss something important. I'm actually pretty good at chemistry." "That's great. Patterson runs a tight ship, but he's fair. The labs are usually pretty straightforward if you follow the procedures." As Mr. Patterson began the class introduction, Madison found herself studying more than just his lips. She watched how students reacted to different announcements, noticed who paid attention and who tried to hide their phones under their desks. Her eyes swept the room regularly, a habit that had developed over years of needing to be aware of her surroundings. That's when she first noticed the group in the back corner. 3 boys sat clustered around the last lab table, and something about their body language immediately caught Madison's attention. They weren't focused on Mr. Patterson's lecture about lab safety and semester expectations. Instead, they seemed to be conducting their own quiet conversation, heads bent together in a way that suggested secrecy rather than simple inattention. Boy in the center appeared to be the leader, blonde hair, perfectly styled, expensive-looking clothes, the kind of confident posture that came from never being challenged. Madison couldn't catch their whispered words, but she could see the dynamic clearly. The other 2 boys, one with red hair and freckles, the other with dark hair and a nervous energy, kept glancing at their leader for approval before speaking. Mr. Patterson turned to write on the whiteboard. The blonde boy pulled out his phone. Madison watched as he showed something on the screen to his companions. Whatever it was made the redhead snicker and the dark-haired boy look uncomfortable. The blonde boy's expression was cold, calculating the look of someone who enjoyed having power over others. Madison had seen that expression before. It was the look of a bully who'd found a target. The class continued with Mr. Patterson explaining the semester's major projects and grade breakdown. Madison took careful notes, but part of her attention remained on the group in the back. When the teacher announced that lab partners would be working together for the entire semester, she saw the blonde boy's eyes sweep the room, cataloging potential victims with the practiced gaze of a predator. His eyes lingered on several students, a girl with thick glasses who sat alone, a boy who kept tugging nervously at his sleeves, and finally, inevitably, on Madison herself. She met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, that she'd noticed his attention and wasn't intimidated by it. The bell rang, and students began packing up their materials. Madison was organizing her notebook when Tyler touched her shoulder gently to get her attention. The guy in the back corner, Derek Walsh, he's bad news, Tyler said, positioning himself so she could read his lips clearly. He's got a reputation for making life difficult for people he thinks are different. Just be careful around him. Madison glanced toward the back of the room where Derek was laughing loudly with his friends. Thanks for the warning. I can usually handle guys like him. I'm sure you can. But Derek's not just a typical bully. He's smart about it, and his family has influence in this town. Teachers don't always see what he does. The information settled in Madison's mind like pieces of a puzzle. She'd dealt with bullies before, but the warning in Tyler's voice suggested Derek Walsh was something more sophisticated than the usual high school tormentor. As they walked toward the door, Madison noticed Derek deliberately positioning himself in the doorway, creating a bottleneck that forced other students to squeeze past him. It was a subtle power play, establishing dominance through minor inconveniences that teachers would dismiss as accidental. Madison waited until the crowd thinned, then walked toward the door with measured steps. Derek was still there, leaning against the frame as if he owned it. When she approached, he didn't move aside. "Excuse me," Madison said clearly, making sure her voice carried the right amount of politeness and firmness. Derek's eyes widened slightly apparently. He'd expected her to be mute as well as deaf. "Oh, so you can talk. That's interesting." He stepped aside, but only barely, forcing her to brush past him. "I'm Derek Walsh. I basically run things around here." Madison paused in the doorway and turned to face him. "I'm Madison Chun, and I don't really care who runs things around here." The exchange lasted only seconds, but Madison could see she'd surprised him. Derek was accustomed to intimidation working immediately. Her calm response had disrupted his usual script. His friends had been watching the interaction, and Madison noticed how quickly they looked away when Derek's confident expression faltered. The redhead seemed eager to leave, while the dark-haired boy appeared almost relieved the confrontation hadn't escalated. "Well, Madison Chen," Derek said, recovering his composure, "I think we're going to be seeing a lot of each other." There was something in his tone that made it sound less like a friendly prediction and more like a threat. Madison nodded politely and continued down the hallway, but she could feel Derek's eyes following her until she turned the corner. Her next class was a P literature with Miss Harper, and Madison found herself thinking about the brief encounter as she navigated the crowded hallways. She'd learned to trust her instincts about people, and everything about Derek Walsh set off warning signals. The way he'd positioned himself to control the doorway, the calculating look in his eyes, the immediate attempt to establish dominance. These were the behaviors of someone who used power to hurt others. But Madison had also noticed something else. For just a moment, when she'd refused to be intimidated, Derek had looked genuinely surprised. He wasn't used to resistance, especially not from someone he probably saw as an easy target. That surprise could be useful. The literature classroom was arranged in a circle, encouraging discussion and participation. Madison chose a seat where she could see most of the other students' faces, knowing that class discussions would be challenging but manageable if she could follow the visual cues. Ms. Harper was an energetic woman in her 30s with short brown hair and an enthusiasm that radiated from her posture and expressions. She welcomed Madison warmly and made sure she had a copy of the syllabus before beginning her introduction to the semester's reading list. "We'll be exploring themes of justice, power, and moral courage in literature," Ms. Harper explained. "These are stories about people who chose to stand up for what's right, even when it was difficult or dangerous." Madison found herself genuinely interested in the curriculum. Books like To Kill a Mockingbird, The Crucible, and Speak dealt with characters who faced impossible choices and found the strength to do what was right. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was studying moral courage, while potentially facing a bully who represented everything these books warned against. As the class progressed, Madison noticed she wasn't the only new student. A girl with curly auburn hair and green eyes sat across the circle, and Madison could see her nervousness in the way she kept glancing around the room and fidgeting with her pencil. When Ms. Harper asked students to introduce themselves and share their favorite book, the new girl spoke with a slight Southern accent. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm Lily Davidson. I just moved here from Atlanta, and I guess my favorite book is The Outsiders because it's about finding your place when you don't quite fit in anywhere." Madison felt an immediate connection to Lily's honesty. When her own turn came, she spoke clearly and confidently. "I'm Madison Chen. I moved here from Sacramento, and my favorite book is The Giver, because it's about someone who sees things differently and has to decide what to do with that knowledge." Several students nodded approvingly, and Madison caught Lily's eye across the circle. The other girls smiled, and Madison sensed the beginning of a friendship. The period passed quickly, with Ms. Harper outlining their first assignment, a personal essay about a time they'd witnessed or experienced injustice. Madison's mind immediately went to several incidents from her previous schools, times when she'd seen students marginalized or mistreated because they were different. As class ended, Lily approached Madison with a tentative smile. "I really liked what you said about The Giver. That's actually one of my favorites too. I was wondering, would you maybe want to have lunch together? I don't really know anyone here yet." Madison appreciated the direct approach. "I'd like that. I'm still figuring out how everything works here too." They walked together toward the cafeteria, and Madison found herself explaining some of the basics of communicating with a deaf person. Lily was naturally expressive, which made lip reading easier, and she seemed genuinely interested in learning rather than just being polite. "I took a sign language class in middle school," Lily said as they got in the lunch line. I probably don't remember much, but I'd love to practice if you don't mind. Madison was impressed by Lily's enthusiasm. I'd be happy to help you practice. It's nice to meet someone who's actually interested in learning. The cafeteria was typical of high schools everywhere, loud, crowded, and divided into invisible social territories. Madison and Lily found a table near the windows, away from the main traffic flow. As they ate, Madison found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving at Jefferson High. That's when Derek Walsh appeared. He didn't approach directly. Instead, he and his two friends claimed a table about 20 feet away, close enough to make his presence known, but far enough to avoid obvious confrontation. Madison noticed him immediately, and she could see that his positioning was deliberate. "Friend of yours?" Lily asked, following Madison's gaze. "Not exactly." "That's Derek Walsh. I met him in chemistry class this morning." Lily's expression darkened slightly. "Derek Walsh. I think I've heard that name before. My dad works at the bank, and he mentioned something about the Walsh family being influential around here." Madison filed that information away. Bullies with family connections were always more dangerous because they felt protected from consequences. She watched Derek's table carefully, noting how other students gave them a wide berth. The redhead was showing Derek something on his phone, and whatever it was made Derek smile, not a pleasant expression. "They're watching us," Lily said quietly. Madison had noticed. Derek kept glancing in their direction, and she could see him talking to his friends. The dark-haired boys seemed uncomfortable with whatever Derek was saying, but the redhead appeared eager to participate in whatever was being planned. "Let them watch," Madison said calmly. "They're trying to intimidate us, but the best response is to ignore them." But even as she said it, Madison knew ignoring Derek Walsh wouldn't make him go away. His type of bully thrived on reaction, but they also escalated when their initial intimidation tactics failed. She'd need to be careful, but she wouldn't let fear dictate her behavior. As lunch continued, Madison found herself dividing her attention between her conversation with Lily and her observation of Derek's table. She noticed how he commanded attention from his friends, how they waited for his approval before speaking or laughing. The dynamic reminded her of a pack hierarchy, with Derek as the alpha and the other two competing for his favor. More importantly, she noticed how Derek's behavior changed when teachers or administrators walked nearby. The loud laughter became quieter. The aggressive posturing softened into something that looked more like normal teenage socializing. Derek Walsh understood how to avoid adult attention while maintaining his control over his peers. The lunch period was ending, and students began clearing their tables and heading to their next classes. Madison and Lily walked together toward the exit, and Madison was pleased to discover they shared the same next period, AP History, with Mr. Bradley. As they left the cafeteria, Madison felt someone brush against her roughly. She turned to see Derek Walsh walking past, his movement clearly deliberate. He didn't look back or acknowledge the contact, but Madison could see the smirk on his face as he continued down the hallway. "That was on purpose," Lily said angrily. Madison nodded. "He's testing boundaries, seeing how I'll react to physical contact." "Are you going to report it?" Madison considered the question. A single bump in a crowded hallway wouldn't be taken seriously by administrators, and Derek had been careful to make it look accidental. Reporting minor incidents would only make her look oversensitive and give Derek ammunition to use against her. "Not yet, but I'll remember it." They reached the history classroom, and Madison was grateful to focus on something other than Derek Walsh's mind games. Mr. Bradley was an older man with a reputation for challenging his students intellectually, and Madison looked forward to the academic rigor. But as she took her seat and opened her notebook, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with Derek was just the beginning. The way he'd looked at her, the calculated nature of his actions, the warning from Tyler, everything pointed to a systematic campaign of harassment that was probably already being planned. Madison had dealt with bullies before, but she'd never faced someone who combined cruelty with intelligence and social protection. Derek Walsh represented a new kind of challenge, and she'd need to be smarter than ever to protect herself and potentially others from his tactics. The afternoon passed quickly, with Madison successfully navigating her remaining classes and meeting several more students who seemed genuinely welcoming. By the time the final bell rang, she felt cautiously optimistic about Jefferson High, except for the Derek Walsh problem. As students streamed toward the exits, Madison found herself walking behind a group that included the dark-haired boy from Derek's table. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the tension in his body language. He kept glancing around nervously, as if he expected trouble or was worried about being overheard. Madison's curiosity was piqued. The boy's behavior suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with Derek's leadership, which could be important information. People who were reluctant participants in bullying were often the weak links that could be exploited. Outside the school, Madison waited for her ride and continued observing the social dynamics around her. She watched Derek swagger toward an expensive car where his friends were waiting, noticed how other students avoided making eye contact with him, and cataloged the subtle ways his presence affected the entire atmosphere. But Madison also noticed something else. Several students seemed to be watching Derek's group with expressions that weren't fear or admiration. They were angry. Derek Walsh had clearly made enemies, and Madison wondered if some of them might be potential allies. As her mother's car pulled up to the curb, Madison reflected on her first day at Jefferson High. She'd made at least one friend, connected with several teachers, and identified a significant threat that would require careful handling. Most importantly, she'd established herself as someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Madison felt prepared. She'd learned long ago that being deaf didn't make her helpless, it made her more observant, more aware of her surroundings, and more skilled at reading the subtle communications most people missed. Derek Walsh thought he'd found an easy target. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Madison's second week at Jefferson High brought a disturbing clarity to Derek Walsh's methods. What had seemed like isolated incidents of rudeness were actually part of a systematic campaign designed to isolate and humiliate his chosen targets. Madison began to understand that she wasn't Derek's only victim. She was simply his newest project. The revelation came during her third-period study hall in the library. Madison had claimed a corner table where she could spread out her chemistry notes while keeping an eye on the room's dynamics. The librarian, Mrs. Chun, no relation, despite sharing the same surname, had been particularly welcoming, ensuring Madison knew about all the resources available to help with her studies. Madison was deep in balancing chemical equations when movement in her peripheral vision caught her attention. Near the computer stations, Derek Walsh was approaching a sophomore girl who's working alone on what appeared to be a history report. The girl, Madison recognized her as Emma Rodriguez from her Spanish class, was small for her age, with thick glasses and the kind of quiet demeanor that usually made students invisible to bullies. But Derek had noticed Emma, and Madison could see why. The girl's backpack was worn and patched, her clothes were clean but clearly secondhand, and she had the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make herself as small as possible. Emma represented everything Derek seemed to despise: vulnerability, difference, and worst of all, the inability to fight back effectively. Madison watched as Derek positioned himself behind Emma's chair, close enough to be intimidating but not so close that casual observers would notice anything unusual. He leaned down as if he were offering help, but Madison could see the tension in Emma's shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she continued typing. Derek's friends, Marcus Flynn and James Chun again, no relation, flanked him at a respectful distance. Marcus, the redhead, seemed eager to participate in whatever harassment was about to unfold. James, the dark-haired boy, looked uncomfortable but didn't move away. Madison was beginning to recognize this pattern: Derek as the primary aggressor, Marcus as the enthusiastic accomplice, and James as the reluctant witness who lacked the courage to intervene. Madison couldn't hear what Derek was saying to Emma, but she could read the interaction through body language and facial expressions. Derek's mouth moved in what appeared to be a stream of quiet comments, each one causing Emma to flinch or hunch her shoulders further. Her typing became more erratic, and Madison could see her deleting and retyping the same sentences repeatedly. Most disturbing part was how Derek had positioned himself to avoid the librarian's attention. Mrs. Chun was helping students at the reference desk, her back turned to the computer area. Derek had calculated the sightlines perfectly, creating a pocket of harassment that was invisible to adult supervision. Madison found herself torn between intervention and observation. Every instinct told her to walk over and disrupt Derek's attack on Emma, but she also recognized the strategic value of understanding his methods. If she was going to protect herself and others from Derek's bullying, she needed to know exactly how he operated. Derek's harassment continued for nearly 10 minutes. Madison watched as he gradually escalated his tactics, moving closer to Emma's chair, making gestures that caused her to flinch, apparently commenting on her appearance and her work. Marcus contributed by snickering at Derek's comments and making faces that Emma could see in the reflection of her computer screen. The breakthrough came when Derek grew bolder. He reached over Emma's shoulder and apparently deleted something from her document, because Emma's reaction was immediate and distressed. She turned in her chair to face Derek, and Madison could see her mouth forming the word, "please," followed by what looked like a request to leave her alone. Derek's response was swift and cruel. He leaned closer and said something that made Emma's face crumple. Madison couldn't read his lips from her angle, but she could see the devastating effect his words had on their target. Emma's hands flew to her face, and Madison realized the girl was crying. That's when Derek made his crucial mistake. Satisfied with Emma's reaction, he straightened up and turned slightly, bringing his face into Madison's line of sight. As he spoke to Marcus, Madison caught enough of his words to understand what he'd said to Emma. "Maybe if you weren't so pathetic, your dad wouldn't have left your family." The cruelty was breathtaking. Derek hadn't just attacked Emma's appearance or her schoolwork, he'd weaponized personal information about her family situation. Madison felt a surge of anger at the calculated nature of the assault, but she also felt something else. Derek had just revealed how he gathered intelligence on his victims. Madison began paying closer attention to the social networks around Derek. Over the next few days, she noticed how information flowed through the school's gossip channels and how Derek positioned himself to collect useful ammunition. He befriended students who worked in the counseling office, dated girls who had access to social media accounts, and cultivated relationships with people who heard family conversations at part-time jobs around town. Derek Walsh wasn't just a bully, he was an information broker who used personal details to inflict maximum psychological damage on his targets. The realization made Madison reassess every interaction she'd had at Jefferson High. How much did Derek already know about her family situation? What personal details might he have gathered to use against her? The answer came sooner than expected. During lunch on Friday, Madison was sitting with Lily and Tyler when Derek approached their table. His timing was perfect. The cafeteria was crowded and noisy, providing cover for whatever he had planned. "Madison Chun," Derek said, his voice carrying a fake friendliness that didn't match his cold eyes. "I've been learning some interesting things about you." Madison looked up from her sandwich, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm sure you have. Your family owns that little import business downtown, right? Chun Family Trading? I heard it's been struggling since the pandemic. Must be tough, having to rely on your dad's connections in the Chinese community just to stay afloat." The comment was designed to hit multiple targets: Madison's family's financial situation, her father's ethnicity, and the implication that their business success was somehow illegitimate. Madison felt Tyler tense beside her and saw Lily's eyes widen in shock at Derek's audacity. But Madison had been expecting something like this. Derek's intelligence gathering was impressive, but it was also his weakness. He'd revealed that he knew specific details about her family's business, which meant he'd been asking questions around town. People would remember those questions, and patterns of inquiry could be traced back to their source. "You're right," Madison said calmly. "My family's business has faced challenges. Most small businesses have. But we're adapting, and we're still here." Derek's expression flickered. He'd expected defensiveness or embarrassment, not calm acknowledgement. "I also heard your parents are getting divorced. That must be why you moved here so suddenly. Running away from problems at home?" This was pure fabrication, and Madison knew it. Her parents had a strong marriage, and the move to Jefferson had been entirely about her father's job opportunity. But Derek's willingness to invent personal tragedies revealed something important about his methods. He combined real information with manufactured details to create maximum emotional impact. "My parents are happily married," Madison said, her voice steady. "But I'm curious about where you heard that rumor. It says more about your sources than it does about my family." The response caught Derek off guard. He'd expected denial or anger, not a counterattack that questioned his information network. Madison could see him recalculating, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Whatever," Derek said, his mask of fake friendliness slipping. "Just remember that I know everything that happens in this school. Everything about everyone. Including you." He walked away, but Madison could see the frustration in his posture. The encounter had been a victory of sorts. She'd demonstrated that his psychological tactics wouldn't work on her, and she'd gathered valuable intelligence about his methods. "That was intense," Lily said once Derek was out of earshot. "How did you stay so calm?" Madison was still processing the encounter. "He was testing me, trying to see which buttons would make me react. But he also revealed how he operates. He collects information from multiple sources and combines truth with lies to create maximum damage." Tyler nodded approvingly. "That's exactly right. Derek's been doing this for years. He builds psychological profiles of his targets and then uses their vulnerabilities against them." "But why doesn't anyone stop him?" Lily asked. "Surely the teachers know what he's doing." Madison had been wondering the same thing. Over the weekend, she decided to investigate Derek's protection system. She spent time in the school's common areas, observing how Derek interacted with different types of people. What she discovered was a sophisticated network of relationships that insulated him from consequences. Derek's father was a prominent lawyer who'd represented several school board members in legal matters. His mother served on the parent-teacher association and donated generously to school programs. Derek himself maintained a carefully crafted public image. He was polite to teachers, participated in approved school activities, and was careful to never leave evidence of his bullying that could be traced back to him. More importantly, Derek had cultivated relationships with students who held positions of influence. He dated the student council president, maintained friendships with the captains of various sports teams, and had connections to the students who worked in the main office. These relationships provided him with advance warning of any investigations and gave him allies who would vouch for his character if questioned. Madison realized she was dealing with someone who'd spent years building a system that made him essentially untouchable through normal channels. Teachers couldn't discipline him for behavior they couldn't prove, and students were afraid to report him because they knew he'd retaliate with information that could destroy their reputations or relationships. The scope of Derek's operation became clear during Madison's second week of observation. She began noticing patterns in how certain students behaved, flinching when Derek approached, changing their routes through the hallways to avoid him, sitting in specific areas of the cafeteria. that were outside his usual territory. Madison started mapping Derek's victim network. There was Emma Rodriguez, the sophomore who'd been harassed in the library. Carlos Martinez, a freshman who'd apparently been targeted for his accent and his family's economic situation. Jennifer Walsh, ironically sharing Derek's surname, who'd been tormented about her weight and her struggles with an eating disorder. Each victim had been carefully selected for maximum vulnerability and minimum ability to fight back. Derek didn't target popular students or those with strong social connections. He chose isolated individuals who had personal struggles that could be exploited and who lacked the resources to defend themselves effectively. But Madison also noticed something else. Derek's victims weren't passive. They developed their own coping strategies and support networks. Emma Rodriguez had started arriving at school early and leaving late to avoid Derek's schedule. Carlos Martinez had found protection by joining the chess club, whose members looked out for each other. Jennifer Walsh had connected with other students who shared her struggles and provided mutual support. The realization gave Madison hope. Derek was powerful, but he wasn't invincible. His victims were survivors who'd found ways to resist his campaign of psychological terrorism. If they could be organized and supported, they might be able to fight back effectively. Madison began developing her own strategy. She started sitting in different areas of the cafeteria, positioning herself where she could observe Derek's interactions with various students. She volunteered for hall monitor duties that gave her access to different parts of the school during class transitions. She joined study groups that included students from different social circles, allowing her to gather information about Derek's activities across the entire school. Most importantly, Madison began documenting Derek's behavior. She couldn't hear his verbal harassment, but she could see the patterns of intimidation, the calculated positioning to avoid adult supervision, and the systematic nature of his attacks. She started keeping a detailed log of incidents, noting times, locations, and witnesses. The documentation revealed the true scope of Derek's activities. He wasn't just a bully, he was running a campaign of psychological warfare against multiple students simultaneously. His methods were sophisticated enough to avoid detection by adults, but consistent enough to create a pattern that could be analyzed and potentially predicted. Madison's investigation also revealed Derek's vulnerabilities. His system depended on secrecy and isolation. He worked to keep his victims from connecting with each other, knowing that shared experiences would validate their stories and potentially lead to collective resistance. He also relied on his information network, which meant he was vulnerable to misinformation and strategic deception. By the end of her second week at Jefferson High, Madison had identified her strategy. She wouldn't try to defeat Derek through conventional means, reporting to teachers, confronting him directly, or appealing to his better nature. Instead, she would use her unique advantages as a deaf student to gather intelligence that hearing students would miss, document his crimes in ways that couldn't be dismissed, and build a coalition of survivors who could support each other and fight back collectively. Derek Walsh thought he controlled Jefferson High through fear and information. He was about to discover that someone was watching him more carefully than he'd ever imagined, and that his reign of psychological terror was about to face its first real challenge. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything. Madison had learned about reading people, understanding social dynamics, and using silence as a weapon against those who thrived on others' pain. Derek had chosen the wrong target, and Madison was about to show him exactly how wrong he'd been. Madison's third week at Jefferson High marked the beginning of her transformation from observer to organizer. She'd spent enough time analyzing Derek Walsh's methods to understand that defeating him would require more than individual resistance. It would take a coordinated effort from his victims and their allies. The challenge was bringing people together who'd been deliberately isolated and convinced they were powerless. The opportunity came during an unexpected encounter in the school's darkroom. Madison had signed up for photography as an elective, partly because she enjoyed the artistic aspects and partly because the darkroom provided a quiet space where she could think without the constant visual noise of crowded hallways. She was developing prints from her first assignment when someone else entered the small, red-lit space. Emma Rodriguez stood in the doorway, clutching a roll of film and looking uncertain about whether to stay or leave. Madison recognized the girl from Derek's harassment in the library, and she could see that Emma was still carrying the psychological wounds from that encounter. Her shoulders were hunched defensively, and she kept glancing around as if expecting an attack. "It's okay," Madison said softly, making sure Emma could see her face in the dim red light. "There's plenty of space for both of us." Emma hesitated, then stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I didn't know anyone else was in here. I can come back later if you need privacy." "Stay," Madison said firmly. "I could use the company, and you look like you know what you're doing with that equipment." The invitation seemed to surprise Emma. Madison watched as the girl's defensive posture relaxed slightly, and she moved toward the developing station with more confidence. They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes, the quiet ritual of chemical processing creating a peaceful atmosphere that seemed to ease Emma's anxiety. "You're Madison Chun," Emma said eventually, her voice barely above a whisper. "The new girl in my Spanish class." Madison nodded. "And you're Emma Rodriguez. I've seen you around school." The simple acknowledgement seemed to mean something to Emma. Madison could see tears forming in the girl's eyes, and she realized how long it had been since someone had spoken to Emma, like a normal person rather than a target or a victim to be pitied. "Derek Walsh has been making your life difficult," Madison said directly. It wasn't a question. Emma's reaction was immediate and fearful. She glanced toward the door, as if Derek might appear at any moment, and her hands trembled as she nearly dropped her film canister. "I don't know what you're talking about." Madison recognized the response. It was the same defensive denial she'd seen from other victims of systematic bullying. Emma had been trained to believe that speaking about Derek's harassment would only make things worse, and she was probably right under normal circumstances. "I know because I've been watching him," Madison said calmly. "I saw what he did to you in the library last week. The way he positioned himself to avoid Mrs. Chun's attention, how he used personal information about your family to hurt you. I saw all of it." Emma's eyes widened. "You were watching. Why didn't you help me?" The question contained both accusation and hope, and Madison knew her answer would determine whether Emma would trust her or retreat further into isolation. "Because I was learning how he operates. Derek isn't just picking on individual students. Randomly, he's running a systematic campaign against multiple targets. To stop him, I needed to understand his methods." Madison moved closer to Emma, making sure the girl could see her face clearly in the red light. "But more importantly, I've been watching you too. You're not as helpless as Derek wants you to believe. You've developed strategies to avoid him, you've found safe spaces in the school, and you've survived his attacks without letting him completely destroy your spirit. You're stronger than you know." The validation seemed to hit Emma like a physical force. She sat down heavily on a stool, and Madison could see years of pent-up frustration and pain beginning to surface. "He knows things about my family that I never told anyone. My dad left when I was 8, and my mom works 2 jobs just to keep us in our apartment. Derek somehow found out, and he uses it against me constantly." Madison felt a surge of anger at Derek's cruelty, but she kept her voice steady. "How do you think he learned those details?" Emma considered the question. "I don't know. I never talk about personal stuff at school. I try to keep to myself." "But Derek has sources," Madison explained. "He's built a network of people who feed him information about students' personal lives. Some of them don't even realize they're helping him. They think they're just gossiping or sharing interesting stories." The revelation seemed to energize Emma. "You mean he's not just guessing about people's problems? He's actually investigating us? Madison nodded. Exactly. And that's both his strength and his weakness. His system depends on information flow, which means it can be disrupted or even turned against him. Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing this new understanding of her tormentor. When she spoke again, her voice carried a hint of something Madison hadn't heard before: determination. What did you have in mind? Madison smiled. I think it's time Derek's victims started talking to each other. He's worked hard to keep everyone isolated and ashamed, but isolation is what makes us vulnerable. Together we might be able to do something about him. The conversation continued as they finished their darkroom work, and by the time they emerged into the bright hallway, Madison had gained her first confirmed ally. Emma agreed to help identify other victims and to start documenting Derek's behavior from her perspective. More importantly, she agreed to stop accepting that Derek's harassment was something she had to endure alone. The next step was approaching Carlos Martinez, the freshman who'd been targeted for his accent and family background. Madison found him during lunch, sitting alone at a corner table with a book propped open in front of his tray. She could see that the book was positioned to create a barrier between Carlos and the rest of the cafeteria, another defensive strategy developed by one of Derek's victims. Madison approached slowly, making sure Carlos could see her coming. She'd learned that Derek's victims were often hyper-vigilant about their surroundings, and sudden approaches could trigger panic responses. Mind if I sit down? The other tables are pretty crowded. Carlos looked up from his book, a science fiction novel Madison recognized, and nodded uncertainly. He was smaller than most freshmen, with intelligent dark eyes and the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make himself invisible. Madison could see similarities between Carlos and Emma. Both were bright students who'd been targeted for their vulnerabilities rather than any lack of ability or character. Good book, Madison said, settling into the chair across from him. I read that series last summer. Have you gotten to the part where they discover the truth about the simulation? The question surprised Carlos, and Madison could see him relaxing slightly as they discussed the book's plot. She'd learned that Derek's victims were often starved for normal social interaction, and engaging with their interests rather than their problems was an effective way to build trust. After several minutes of conversation about science fiction, Madison shifted the topic carefully. I'm new here, but I've noticed some students seem to have a harder time than others. Is Jefferson High usually this intense? Carlos's expression darkened, and he glanced around the cafeteria nervously. It depends on who you are and whether certain people decide they don't like you. Madison followed his gaze and saw Derek Walsh holding court at his usual table, surrounded by his friends and admirers. Someone like Derek Walsh? The name made Carlos flinch visibly. I don't want to talk about him. It just makes things worse. Madison recognized the fear response, but she also sensed that Carlos wanted to talk to someone who might understand his situation. I get it. But sometimes keeping quiet doesn't actually make things better. It just makes the person causing problems think they can get away with anything. Carlos was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a voice so low Madison had to read his lips carefully. He started targeting me this second week of school. Someone told him my family doesn't have papers, and he's been threatening to report us to immigration. My mom cleans offices at night, and my dad does construction, and if they get deported. Madison felt her anger at Derek reach a new level. Threatening a student's family with deportation was beyond typical bullying. It was a form of terrorism that could destroy lives. But she also recognized an opportunity. Derek's escalation meant he was becoming overconfident and potentially making mistakes. Carlos, that's not just bullying, that's extortion. And Derek doesn't actually have the power to get your family deported. He's using your fear to control you, but his threats are mostly empty. Carlos looked skeptical. How can you be sure? Madison had done her research on the Walsh family's actual influence. Because Derek's father is a corporate lawyer who handles business contracts, not immigration cases. And Derek himself is just a high school student with no connections to federal agencies. He's counting on you not knowing how immigration law actually works. The information seemed to give Carlos hope, but Madison could see he was still afraid to act. She understood his hesitation. Derek's psychological manipulation was designed to make victims feel powerless even when they had options. "There's something else," Madison continued. "Derek isn't just targeting you. He's running similar campaigns against other students, using their specific vulnerabilities against them. Emma Rodriguez, Jennifer Walsh, and probably several others. We haven't identified yet." Carlos's eyes widened. "You mean I'm not the only one?" "Definitely not. Derek has turned bullying into a systematic operation, and he's worked to keep his victims isolated so they won't realize how many of them there are. But what if that isolation ended? What if his targets started supporting each other instead of suffering alone?" The conversation planted seeds that Madison hoped would grow into action. She gave Carlos her contact information and promised to check in with him regularly. More importantly, she helped him understand that Derek's power was largely psychological, and that collective resistance could neutralize many of his tactics. Madison's third target was Jennifer Walsh, and approaching her required more delicate handling. Jennifer was Derek's distant cousin, which complicated the family dynamics, and her struggles with an eating disorder made her particularly vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Madison found her in the school nurse's office where Jennifer was apparently taking prescribed medication during lunch period. "Are you feeling okay?" Madison asked, genuinely concerned about Jennifer's pale complexion and thin frame. Jennifer looked surprised that someone was speaking to her with genuine concern rather than pity or judgment. "Just managing some health issues." "Are you here for medication too?" Madison shook her head. "I was looking for information about student support services. I heard the nurse keeps resources for students dealing with different challenges." The conversation evolved naturally as they discussed the various support programs available at Jefferson High. Madison learned that Jennifer was already working with a counselor about her eating disorder, which suggested she had more resources and resilience than Derek probably realized. "It must be difficult being related to Derek Walsh," Madison said carefully. Watching Jennifer's reaction, Jennifer's face tightened. "People assume we're close because we share a last name, but we're barely related and we definitely don't agree on anything. Derek thinks having Walsh in his name gives him permission to treat people however he wants." Madison sensed an opening. "Has he treated you badly too?" Jennifer hesitated, then seemed to decide that Madison could be trusted. "He knows about my eating disorder, and he makes comments about my weight constantly. At family gatherings, he tells everyone I'm anorexic and makes jokes about it. My parents think he's just being a typical teenage boy, but his comments make everything worse." Madison felt her understanding of Derek's cruelty deepen. He wasn't just targeting strangers, he was willing to torment his own family members for psychological entertainment. But Jennifer's situation also represented an opportunity. As Derek's relative, she might have access to information and insights that other victims couldn't provide. "Jennifer, what would you say if I told you that several other students are dealing with Derek's harassment and were thinking about working together to document his behavior and build support for each other?" The suggestion clearly appealed to Jennifer. "You mean like a support group for his victims?" Madison nodded. "Exactly. Derek's power comes from keeping everyone isolated and ashamed. But if his targets started sharing information and supporting each other, he'd lose a lot of his psychological leverage." Jennifer was quiet for several minutes, considering the implications. When she spoke again, her voice carried a determination that reminded Madison of Emma's transformation in the darkroom. "I'm tired of being afraid of my own cousin. If there's a way to fight back that doesn't put my recovery at risk, I want to be part of it." By the end of the week, Madison had successfully connected with 3 of Derek's primary victims, and laid the groundwork for a support network that could challenge his reign of psychological terror. Each conversation had revealed new aspects of Derek's methods and had identified potential strategies for resistance. Madison realized she was building something unprecedented at Jefferson High, a coalition of Derek's targets, who were refusing to accept their victimization and were instead choosing to fight back collectively. The network was still fragile, and its members were still afraid, but the foundation had been laid for something that could genuinely threaten Derek's control over the school's social dynamics. The stage was set for the next phase of Madison's plan, transforming Derek's victims from isolated targets into an organized resistance movement that could use his own methods against him. Derek Walsh had built his empire on fear, secrets, and psychological manipulation. Madison was about to show him what happened when his victims stopped being afraid and started fighting back together. The real battle for Jefferson High was about to begin, and Derek had no idea what was coming for him. Madison's carefully built network was about to face its ultimate test. 3 weeks into her plan, Derek Walsh had grown increasingly frustrated by his inability to break Madison's spirit, and his escalating tactics were about to cross a line that would finally give her the evidence she needed to destroy his empire of fear. The opportunity came during the Jefferson High Fall Festival, an annual fundraising event that brought together students, parents, and community members for carnival games, food booths, and performances. Madison had volunteered to help with the photography booth, which gave her perfect cover to move throughout the festival grounds while documenting everything she saw. Derek had also volunteered for festival duties, but his motivations were far from altruistic. Madison watched as he used his position managing the ticket booth to identify potential new targets among visiting middle school students who might be attending Jefferson next year. His predatory behavior was more obvious in the less structured environment of the festival, and Madison realized this might be her chance to catch him in the act. The first incident occurred near the dunking booth, where Derek cornered a 7th-grade girl who was visiting with her older sister. The girl, who appeared to have some form of developmental disability, was excited about trying the ring toss game, but was struggling with the coordination required. Derek approached her with his typical false friendliness, but Madison could see the cruelty lurking beneath his helpful facade. Madison positioned herself at a nearby booth and began recording with her phone, making sure to capture Derek's interaction with the young girl. She watched as he offered to help her with the game, then deliberately gave her faulty rings that couldn't possibly land on the targets. When the girl became frustrated and upset, Derek began making comments about her abilities that were designed to look like encouragement to casual observers, but were actually psychological attacks. "You're doing great. Some people just aren't coordinated enough for games like this," Derek said, his voice loud enough for other visitors to hear. "Maybe you should try something easier, like the kiddie games over there." Madison could see the girl's excitement turning to shame and confusion. Her older sister was busy talking to friends and hadn't noticed Derek's manipulation, leaving the vulnerable middle schooler isolated with her tormentor. Madison felt her anger building, but she forced herself to keep recording and gathering evidence rather than intervening immediately. Derek's performance continued for several minutes, systematically destroying the girl's confidence while maintaining his image as a helpful volunteer. Madison captured every moment, knowing that the footage would clearly show the calculated nature of Derek's cruelty. But she also began moving closer, ready to intervene if Derek crossed into more dangerous territory. The escalation came when Derek guided the girl toward a more isolated area of the festival grounds, claiming he wanted to show her a game that would be more appropriate for someone like her. Madison felt alarm bells ringing in her head. This was the pattern she'd seen Derek use before, isolating his victims to avoid witnesses during his most vicious attacks. Madison immediately began following them, but she also did something else. She started signing to Tyler Morrison, who was working at a nearby booth. and had learned some basic sign language to communicate with her. Tyler couldn't understand her rapid signing completely, but he recognized her urgency and began moving to get help from adult volunteers. Derek led the girl behind the main stage area, where the sound equipment and electrical cables were stored. It was a perfect location for harassment, isolated enough to avoid casual observation, but still technically part of the festival grounds. Madison crept closer, using the stage equipment as cover while keeping her phone camera focused on Derek and his victim. What she captured next exceeded her worst expectations of Derek's behavior. "You know," Derek said to the confused girl, "I bet your parents get really tired of dealing with someone like you. It must be embarrassing for them when you can't do simple things that normal kids can do." The girl's face crumpled, and Madison could see her beginning to cry. But Derek wasn't finished. He pulled out his own phone and began taking pictures of the girl's distress, apparently planning to use the images for future harassment or humiliation. "These photos are going to be hilarious," Derek continued. "I should post them online so everyone can see what happens when stupid people try to play normal games. Maybe your new school will see them when you apply next year." Madison had seen enough. Derek wasn't just bullying a vulnerable child, he was creating photographic evidence that could be used to torment her for years. This had moved beyond psychological harassment into documented exploitation of a minor with disabilities. Madison stepped out from behind the sound equipment, her phone still recording. "That's enough, Derek." Derek spun around, surprised by her sudden appearance. "Madison, I didn't see you there. I was just helping this girl find her way back to her family." "I recorded everything," Madison said calmly, holding up her phone so Derek could see the recording interface, "including the photos you just took and your plans to post them online." Derek's expression shifted from surprise to calculation to rage in a matter of seconds. Madison could see him considering his options: deny everything, try to grab her phone, or attempt to discredit her as a witness. What he didn't know was that Madison had already sent the video file to cloud storage and had shared her location with Tyler and Emma. "You're bluffing," Derek said finally. "Nobody's going to believe a deaf girl over me. Besides, there's nothing illegal about helping a lost kid." Madison smiled, and Derek seemed to realize for the first time that he might have underestimated his opponent. "Actually, Derek, there are several illegal things about what you just did. Taking photos of a minor without permission, planning to post those photos online for harassment purposes, and targeting a child with disabilities for psychological abuse. Any one of those could get you charged with serious crimes." The girl Derek had been tormenting was looking back and forth between them, clearly confused by the confrontation. Madison knelt down to her level and spoke gently. "Hi there, I'm Madison. I think your sister might be looking for you. Would you like me to help you find her?" The girl nodded eagerly, and Madison stood up, keeping herself between the child and Derek. "We're going to walk back to the main festival area now. Derek won't be bothering you anymore." Derek stepped forward, his mask of civility completely gone. "You have no idea who you're messing with, Madison. My family runs this town, and I can make your life hell in ways you can't even imagine." Madison had been waiting for this moment, Derek's complete loss of control, captured on video, in front of a witness. "Actually, Derek, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And after today, so will everyone else." As they walked back toward the main festival area, Madison used her free hand to send a pre-written text message to several recipients. Code red, Derek recorded, "Send backup to main stage area now." Within minutes, Madison's support network was in motion. Emma appeared first, followed by Tyler and then Jennifer Walsh. Carlos arrived with his older brother, who worked as a security guard and understood the legal implications of what Derek had done. Madison had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and every member of her team knew their role. Jennifer Walsh proved to be the key to the final confrontation. As Derek's cousin, She had access to family information that none of his other victims possessed, and she'd been documenting Derek's behavior from a unique perspective for weeks. "Derek," Jennifer said as the group assembled near the main stage, "you need to delete those photos right now and apologize to this girl and her family." Derek's rage was now focused on his cousin. "Stay out of this, Jennifer. This doesn't concern you." "Actually, it concerns all of us," Jennifer replied, her voice steady despite the family dynamics at play. "Because we've all been documenting your behavior for weeks, and we have evidence of harassment, extortion, threats against multiple students, and now exploitation of a minor with disabilities." Madison watched Derek's expression change as he realized the scope of what his victims had been planning. For the first time in his high school career, Derek Walsh was facing organized resistance from people who refused to be intimidated. "You think anyone will believe your little coalition of losers and freaks?" Derek snarled. "I'll destroy all of you before you can even try to report this." That's when Madison played her final card. She pulled out a second phone and showed Derek. The screen, which displayed a live stream to a private social media account that had been documenting his behavior for weeks. "Derek, meet your audience," Madison said calmly. "Everything you've said and done today has been broadcast live to a private group that includes several parents, teachers, and community members who've been following your activities. They've seen you target a vulnerable child, take exploitative photos, and threaten to destroy the lives of students who dare to resist your bullying." Derek's face went white as he realized the implications. His carefully constructed system of plausible deniability had been shattered by technology he'd never considered and coordination he'd never anticipated. The festival security arrived moments later, summoned by Carlos's brother, and Derek found himself facing questions from adults who'd witnessed his behavior through Madison's live stream. His parents were called, and for the first time, Derek Walsh was forced to account for his actions in front of people who had the power to impose real consequences. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Derek's photos of the vulnerable girl were deleted under supervision, and formal complaints were filed with both the school district and local police regarding his targeting of minors and his systematic harassment. Campaign. The live stream evidence made denial impossible, and Derek's network of protection began crumbling as adults realized the scope of his activities. Madison's coalition of victims became a coalition of survivors who'd found their voices and their power. Emma Rodriguez gained confidence from speaking truth to authority and discovered she had allies she'd never imagined. Carlos Martinez learned that Derek's threats about immigration were empty and that standing up to bullies was possible when you weren't facing them alone. Jennifer Walsh proved that family loyalty didn't require enabling abuse, and that doing the right thing sometimes meant confronting the people closest to you. Derek Walsh's reign of psychological terror at Jefferson High ended not with violence or administrative intervention, but with the power of organized resistance and documented truth. His victims had refused to remain silent, and their collective voice had proven stronger than his individual cruelty. Madison Chun had arrived at Jefferson High as a deaf student who others might have seen as an easy target. She left her mark as someone who'd shown that silence could be a weapon for justice when wielded by someone who saw everything, understood the patterns others missed, and refused to let fear prevent her from acting. The festival continued around them, but for Madison and her allies, the real celebration was just beginning. They'd proven that bullies like Derek Walsh were only as powerful as the silence that protected them. And they'd shown that sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the one who changes everything. Derek Walsh had made the mistake of targeting someone who turned her perceived weakness into an unexpected strength, and who understood that the most powerful resistance sometimes comes from those who've learned to communicate in ways that others never suspect. Madison's sign language hadn't just helped her navigate the world. It had become the tool that exposed Derek's crimes and gave voice to those who'd been silenced by fear. Justice had found its voice in the most unexpected place. the silent witness, who saw everything and finally decided to speak. The weeks following, Derek's exposure brought sweeping changes to Jefferson High that none of them had anticipated. Madison's documentation had revealed not just Derek's individual crimes, but a larger culture of enabling and willful blindness that had allowed his behavior to flourish unchecked for years. Principal Martinez called an emergency meeting with the school board 3 days after the festival incident. Madison found herself sitting in the administrative conference room, surrounded by adults who were finally taking seriously what students had been experiencing for months. Her interpreter, Mrs. Rodriguez, was present to ensure Madison could participate fully in the proceedings. "Miss Chun," Principal Martinez began, "your evidence has opened our eyes to systematic failures in our anti-bullying policies. We're implementing immediate changes, but we need your input on how to prevent this from happening again." Madison had prepared for this moment. Over the past month, she'd not only documented Derek's crimes, but had researched best practices from other schools that had successfully addressed similar problems. "The issue isn't just individual bullies," she explained. "It's the systems that protect them and isolate their victims." Derek succeeded because he understood how to exploit gaps in adult supervision and how to leverage social hierarchies. School board member Patricia Wells leaned forward with interest. "What specific changes would you recommend?" Madison pulled out a folder containing her research and proposals. First, anonymous reporting systems that bypass the social pressure victims face when they have to identify themselves. Second, mandatory training for teachers and staff on recognizing sophisticated bullying tactics that don't fit traditional patterns. Third, peer mediation programs that connect potential victims with student advocates. The proposals impressed the adults in the room, but Madison wasn't finished. Most importantly, there needs to be follow-up. Derek's victims developed their own support networks because the official systems failed them. Schools need to actively nurture those connections instead of leaving students to fend for themselves. Superintendent Janet Foster took notes throughout Madison's presentation. "These are comprehensive suggestions. Have you discussed them with other students?" "Actually," Madison replied, "Emma Rodriguez, Carlos Martinez, and Jennifer Walsh have been working with me on these proposals. They represent different grade levels and different types of harassment, so their perspectives help shape what I'm presenting today." The adults exchanged glances that Madison interpreted as surprise and approval. They'd expected to be dealing with a single incident and a traumatized victim, but instead they were facing an organized student coalition with practical solutions and evidence-based recommendations. "There's something else," Madison continued. "Derek's behavior wasn't happening in a vacuum. Other students knew what he was doing, and some of them were uncomfortable with it, but didn't know how to intervene safely. James Chun, one of Derek's former friends, has asked to speak with you about what he witnessed." Principal Martinez made notes on his legal pad. "We'll definitely want to interview him." "Are there other students who might have relevant information?" Madison nodded. "Tyler Morrison has been documenting incidents he witnessed in his volunteer work. Several students in student government knew about Derek's information-gathering network, but thought it was just gossip. And there are probably other victims we haven't identified yet who might come forward now that they know they won't be facing Derek's retaliation alone." The meeting continued for 2 hours, with Madison providing detailed timelines, explaining Derek's methods, and offering insights into how the harassment had affected not just direct victims, but the entire school climate. By the end, the adults had a comprehensive understanding of how one student had terrorized dozens of others through psychological manipulation and institutional protection. 2 weeks later, Jefferson High announced the most comprehensive anti-bullying initiative in the district's history. The Silent No More program incorporated all of Madison's recommendations and established new protocols for identifying, investigating, and preventing sophisticated harassment campaigns. Madison was asked to serve as the first student liaison for the program, giving her an official role in shaping school policy. The program's launch brought unexpected recognition. Local media covered the story of how a deaf student had exposed a bullying network and led institutional reform. Madison found herself being interviewed by reporters who were fascinated by how her disability had become an asset in gathering evidence that hearing students had missed. "I think people misunderstand what it means to be deaf," Madison explained to Channel 7's education reporter. "I don't miss sounds, but I notice visual details and body language that others overlook." Derek's victims were communicating their distress in ways that adults weren't trained to see. The interview aired during the evening news, and Madison's phone buzzed with messages from students at other schools who were dealing with similar situations. Emma Rodriguez had started a social media support group for students facing harassment, and membership grew from their small Jefferson High circle to include teenagers from across the region. Carlos Martinez found his voice in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. The boy who'd been terrorized by Derek's immigration threats became an advocate for undocumented students throughout the district. He worked with student government to establish a Know Your Rights workshop series that helped immigrant families understand their legal protections. "Derek used my fear against me," Carlos explained at the first workshop. But fear based on misinformation is just another form of bullying. When we understand our actual rights and options, we take away the power that people like Derek hold over us. Jennifer Walsh's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. Her decision to stand up to her cousin had strained family relationships, but it had also freed her from years of psychological torment. She channeled her insider knowledge of Derek's methods into presentations for parent groups about recognizing signs of sophisticated bullying. Derek wasn't just a problem student, Jennifer told a packed auditorium of concerned parents. He was enabled by adults who thought family loyalty meant ignoring harmful behavior. Parents need to understand that protecting our children sometimes means holding our own family members accountable. The ripple effects extended beyond Jefferson High. Derek's case became a model for how to investigate and prosecute cyber harassment, particularly when it involved minors with disabilities. The photos he'd taken at the festival led to charges that resulted in community service and mandatory counseling. But more importantly, his case established legal precedents for protecting vulnerable students from digital exploitation. Madison's role evolved from victim's advocate to policy consultant. The state education department invited her to participate in developing new guidelines for schools dealing with sophisticated bullying campaigns. Her insights helped shape legislation that required annual training for educators and established funding for peer support programs. Traditional anti-bullying programs focus on obvious physical aggression, Madison explained to a legislative committee. But students like Derek use psychological warfare that's much harder to detect and prove. Schools need tools to recognize and respond to these more sophisticated attacks. The legislative hearings brought Madison into contact with other student advocates from around the state. She discovered a network of young people who'd survived various forms of harassment and had channeled their experiences into activism and reform efforts. The connections she made led to speaking engagements at conferences and workshops throughout the region. 6 months after the festival incident, Madison received an unexpected email from Derek Walsh himself. He was attending counseling sessions as part of his legal agreement and had been working with a therapist to understand the impact of his behavior on others. The email was brief but seemed genuine in its acknowledgement of harm caused. "I know. Apologizing doesn't undo what I did to you and the others," Derek wrote. "But I wanted you to know that I understand now why what I was doing was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope the changes at school will prevent other students from being hurt the way I hurt people." Madison shared the email with Emma, Carlos, and Jennifer before deciding how to respond. They spent an afternoon in the photography darkroom, Now their unofficial meeting space, discussing whether Derek's apparent remorse was genuine and what, if anything, they owed him in terms of acknowledgement. "I'm glad he's getting help," Emma said finally. "But I also think he needs to understand that his victims don't exist to make him feel better about his growth process." Carlos agreed. "The email is really about him wanting to feel less guilty. He's not asking what we need from him. He's telling us what he wants us to know." Jennifer had the most complex relationship with Derek's attempted apology, given their family connection. "I think the therapy is helping him understand the damage he caused, but I also think he's looking for shortcuts to redemption. Real change would mean him actively working to repair harm, not just acknowledging it." Madison ultimately decided to respond with a brief email that acknowledged Derek's message, but emphasized that his growth was his responsibility, not something his victims needed to support or validate. She also forwarded the email to the school counseling staff as evidence that their intervention programs were having some effect. The first anniversary of Madison's arrival at Jefferson High was marked by a school-wide assembly celebrating the Silent No More program's achievements. Madison found herself on stage, addressing the same student body that had once watched Derek terrorize vulnerable classmates without intervention. "Change happened at Jefferson High because people who'd been silent found their voices," Madison told the assembled students. "But it also happened because people who'd been bystanders chose to become allies." Derek Walsh's campaign of harassment ended not because of any single person's courage, but because enough people decided that silence in the face of injustice was no longer acceptable. The assembly concluded with the presentation of the school's first annual Silent No More Awards, recognizing students and staff members who'd shown exceptional courage in confronting harassment and supporting vulnerable community members. Madison was honored to present the awards, but she was even more proud to see that the recipients included students who'd been bystanders during Derek's reign and had since become active advocates for others. As the school year drew a close, Madison reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that first day in Mr. Patterson's chemistry class. She'd arrived at Jefferson High expecting to blend in and focus on academics. Instead, she'd discovered that her unique perspective as a deaf student gave her insights and abilities that could change an entire school culture. The experience had taught Madison that disability could be a source of strength rather than limitation, that silence could be a powerful tool for justice, and that individual courage combined with collective action could overcome even the most entrenched systems of harm. Most importantly, she'd learned that being different wasn't something to hide or overcome. It was something to leverage for the benefit of others who needed advocacy and support. Derek Walsh had targeted Madison because he thought her deafness made her vulnerable and isolated. Instead, he'd awakened a force for justice that had transformed not just Jefferson High, but had begun influencing education policy throughout the state. The bully had been defeated not by superior force, but by superior organization, documentation, and the collective power of people who'd found their voices and refused to be silenced. Madison's story became proof that sometimes the most powerful resistance comes from the most unexpected sources, and that justice often wears the face of someone the world has underestimated. The silent witness had spoken, and her voice had changed everything. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.